nothing interesting in their life ever began with them knowing something. It began with them not knowing something, by definition. You can't learn from a place of knowing. Not that you don't build on what you knew, but if you're going to expand yourself, you don't know it yet. So there's tremendous power in not knowing. In fact, not knowing, I would argue, is your first step to achieving understanding.
Welcome, Beau.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
So tell me a little bit about your journey. How did you move into this connection with humanity and bring science at such a level that you've inspired so many people? What was your calling to go down this route?
God, what was my calling? That's a good question. I suppose my calling is that I just feel like we need things more like, we need more compassion.
Right.
We need more people to come together. We need people to be more humble. I think one of the biggest challenges we face is our certainty.
Yeah.
And so for me, the power of the science in that is the ability to ground certain principles of ways of being in evidence of how your brain works. But also my lab works on complex adaptive systems. So to sort of say, let's take this out of philosophy, say this is actually how nature works. So let's shift the argument and the debate and then say how could we actually implement these things in a way that actually can create the opportunity to expand yourself. Not shift yourself, but expand yourself. And I think that there's tremendous significance and potential in that.
And you talk quite heavily about that your brain's evolved not to see the world as it is.
Yeah.
Unpack that a little bit for me.
Well, so this is not postmodern relativism. There is a world, right?
Yeah.
There is a physical world. It's just that we don't see it. Nor would it actually be useful to see in any literal sense because the world doesn't come with instructions. It doesn't tell you what to do.
Right.
Okay. And because there's so much possibility in any one either moment or physical aspect.
Yeah.
So, and what might be useful in one instance might change in context, might change with time.
Yeah.
So rather than evolving to see the world the way it is, we evolved a brain that is able to make meaning from that world. And more than that, is able to change that meaning according to context and over time. And that's what empowers us to survive, is not only being able to, not all meanings are the same. Some meanings are better than others, right? Contextually. And so that's why we didn't evolve to see the world as the way it is. The other aspect of it is that the information we get from the world, we're forever physically separate from that world.
Right.
Right. So we have no direct access to the reflectances of surfaces other than through the light that falls onto it.
Got it.
And then reflects onto our eyes.
Yeah.
Right? You change the light, you change the information coming from that surface. So, which means that at the most fundamental level of the data that your brain is receiving from the world is completely ambiguous. It could literally mean anything. It could be something that's small and far away, well, large and far away, and small and up close. Or if we were to turn off the lights here, right now the light coming from this black surface would probably be lighter than the amount of light coming from this white surface if we were to turn off the lights. And yet we'd still see this as light and still see that as dark. And yet the information is completely different, changes as the light changes. So it's like we're presented with this impossible mathematical problem. X times y equals z. And we're given z without ever knowing what x or y is. So your brain has to solve this problem, and then it has to layer meaning on top of it.
And if you go back to childhood, are we more accepting of those diverse thoughts, or is it something we're born with to actually compartmentalize this to make sure that we think what we see is what we need to see?
Both, right? So we do come into the world with certain meanings, certain histories, like light comes from above. We have that assumption, or that we're on a ground plane, things like this, and those have fundamental influences on how we see the world. But we also evolved a brain that's plastic. And my PhD is actually in neuroplasticity and how the brain changes with experience, which means that we can continually expand our perception, expand our brain, and change those connections according to that trial and error history.
Right.
Your brain is inherently empirical, right? But it has a substrate on which it's operating, right? But then it can change according to that experience.
So is it absolutely critical, like the people that you hang out with, like you're in Ibiza some of the time, I'm in Bali, the people that we're mixing with is probably very different than the people that are stuck in New York City or in London all the time. Does it get as confound as that, or are we still very open to take influence from wherever it comes?
Well, not everybody's open to taking influence from wherever it comes, right? So, in fact, I would argue that maybe very few people are, though every brain has that possibility.
Got it.
So there's an element of choice in how open you want to be. So, yes, you're definitely influenced by those around you. We know this to be true. As much as you also influence them.
Right.
Which is also one of the really important aspects when if we think about the context of business. Right? That the leader and the personality of the leader is really important, because the personality of the leader can actually become the personality of the company. Okay? And without pulling examples, there are relationships between who that person is and the kind of organization they create. Okay. And so, but in terms of being open to influence, there can be tremendous fear in that, because if I'm open to influence, it means that maybe I have to let go of what I thought to be true before. Right? In order to shift, I actually have to let go sometimes.
So leading to unpack that a bit, because I love that seeing is not knowing, like you do not know, or you may be wrong, or let's presume that person could be right. I loved when you were chatting earlier in the day or yesterday, just about let's move from not seeing to not knowing. How has that been a leading philosophy for you as a scientist?
Hugely. I mean, it underpins science. In fact, I would argue it underpins anything that's innovative or creative, expansive. Why? Because anyone listening to this, I mean, nothing interesting in their life ever began with them knowing something. It began with them not knowing something, by definition. Right? You can't learn from a place of knowing. Right? Not that you don't build on what you knew. Right? But if you're going to expand yourself, you literally you don't know it yet. So there's tremendous power in not knowing. And in fact, not knowing, I would argue, is your first step to achieving understanding. You start with knowing, right? And knowing is great. It's efficient. I know this thing, right? But now I want to expand what I know. I want to understand. Well, my first step is, as I suggest, is the first step from A to B is not B. Your first step is from A to not A, to let go of what you thought to be true before. So I call it doubt, right? We should celebrate doubt in businesses and in our lives, right? But not just in of itself, because now I doubt. Now I need to deviate from what I knew, right? Now I need to diversify my experience, be open to those new kinds of experience, and then from that I can distill a principle, and then from that principle I can decide to do something, and then I do it, and now I get a deeper understanding.
And more respect. More respect.
I would suggest, well, it's more. We also get intrinsic reward. Right. So, like, what's an intrinsic reward? So we have at least two kinds of rewards. You have an extrinsic reward. You do something, and you get a reward for doing that thing, which is different from what you're doing. Right. You work. Your reward is money. Money is different from what you're actually doing. What's the reward of skiing? It's skiing, right? The reward is from the activity itself. And why do we get this intrinsic reward? It's because evolution said, well, whatever you're doing, that's a good idea. We need them to do that more, right? So an orgasm is an intrinsic reward, right? Because it's nature saying, we need to keep them doing that, right? Let's give them some motivation here. And so they keep doing it to propagate. Right? So when you achieve understanding, you get the same kind of hit, right? So it's an intellectual orgasm, right? Why? Because understanding something made you agile, made you flexible, made you more creative, and there's a selective advantage to that. So when you get that understanding, you get this moment of closure. And you get that good feeling. And that propagates you wanting to do it again, right?
So what happens to people that, like I've got friends, I've climbed many of the world's highest summits, I've driven the Dakar, I live in Bali, I got mates that have not left the town, they grew up in, are not interested in a lot of other things, maybe a pint and rugby. Why do people not go down those paths? What makes the difference between us that are insatiably hungry and curious from those that aren't?
Well, first of all, I can't speak to how they're, well, in some sense, how they're different.
Right.
Insofar as them personally, of course.
Yeah.
But in terms of course, there are different personality types. People who are more open, people who are closed.
Yeah.
But I'd also suggest that that stepping into uncertainty, stepping into the known, evolutionary was a really bad idea, right? Because it literally increases the possibility of death. That's one. So it would have been disadvantaged to say, like I said yesterday, like, let's go see what's on the other side of that hill.
Yeah.
Because now the possibility of death increases in the short term. Ironically, it could actually increase your possibility of death or the community increase the probability of survival in the longer term, or at least of the community. Because now you have a bunch of foragers, and then one of them finds the good thing,
and everyone
all the others dies, but now everyone else benefits.
Right.
So there's an advantage there.
Yeah.
But to do that is a step into uncertainty, and so that is really scary. People hate often change, and it's interesting when I ask audiences, which I always do. I said, "How many of you want to change?" They all put their hands up.
Sure.
I said, "Come on, let's be honest. How many of you want the consequence of the change, but not the process of the change?" And it's like, yeah, actually, right? Because that process of change can be really scary and really hard.
Yeah.
Right? They want to get to the end of the benefit of it.
Yeah.
Right? And because we see the world through our evolutionary ancestors, we then experience that cortisol release, that stress, that fear, and our brain cells start degenerating, our immune system starts degenerating, especially over time, right? And yet the irony is that's the only place we can go if we are to expand ourselves, if we are to learn, if we are to achieve understanding.
And do we, by leaning on people that also take risks and get there, like you're helping a lot of leaders as well. Do you position them? Do you position them with other leaders that are used to taking risks to give them the confidence to get there, or do you just encourage them through process?
Both.
Right.
But let's imagine that possibly in some sense, the most powerful one is when they have the motivation to do it themselves.
Right.
So one of the ways I try to engage with that is, let's take you. First of all, everyone's a leader.
Yeah.
Ultimately.
Yeah.
They're the leader of their life.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think that's really important. First of all, a more general point, that if you're going to work with just leaders of organization, really, really important. But if you only work with the leaders of organization, then you're not really going to be able to create that culture ultimately, because it requires everybody interacting. And the metaphor I use is a bit like an empath having a relationship with a narcissist.
Yeah,
right.
That's awesome.
It's not going to work.
Right.
So first of all, everyone needs to be in that place of wanting to evolve.
Yeah.
But the way I try to do it is I also try to try it back to their personal life.
Right.
That this is not a mindset; it's a way of being in the world.
Yeah.
And it's not just when you walk through the doors of your corporation or your organization. It's when you walk through the doors of your life.
Yeah.
With your partner, with your children, and with yourself.
Right.
And if we can show through evidence that this is going to, you're going to do better by being better, and this is how you are better as a being, personally, now they're more likely to embody that and bring that with them to their organization.
And does better mean happier?
That's a really good question. And I don't have the answer to that. Because we know that the pursuit of happiness is one of the worst ways to achieve it.
Yeah.
Okay. And we did a study asking people, imagine you're on your deathbed, and people can do it as they're listening. So imagine you're on your deathbed looking back.
Yeah.
What is it that you want to see? Right? What's a word that you want to define your life? And I don't necessarily mean your purpose. It could be to have a purpose, right? And most people say happy. Okay. The next most popular answer was meaningful. And then another one was authentic. And our hypothesis was that not all purposes are equivalent. Some are better than others. Why? Depending on the context. So then the second part of the study is, how did you fare during COVID as a time of as a proxy for uncertainty?
Right.
And those whose life wanted to be defined by happiness, they did the least well. They had the most stress, the most anxiety, the least creativity. But those who pursued meaningful or wanted their life to be in the pursuit of meaning and authenticity did the best in times of uncertainty. Right? They had the most creativity, the most connection, the least amount of stress. Right? So, and possibly you'd argue possibly the most happiness or maybe most joy.
Yeah.
So it could be that that's very individual, but you could argue that there are some pursuits that are better than others in terms of that sense of well-being. And that might be in relation to meaningfulness and authenticity.
What's the word that you look back, you would look back at life from your deathbed and say, that's the word that I need? Sorry. Throw it at you.
So I'm really torn because to a certain extent, so I'll throw this out there because it's more of a hypothesis.
Right.
But I wonder if we're too much in the pursuit of meaningfulness as opposed to just kind of being relevant and being useful. And because then you could argue that maybe that's where we find meaning is when we're actually useful and supporting others. And I think, and then also whether or not you're aligned in your words and intentions and actions. Because you get a lot of people in Ibiza and Bali, right? Yeah. For instance, a lot of words. These are my intentions. I'm a very spiritual person. Yeah. But you look at them and they look at their behavior. It's like, but are you? Yeah. Right. And a lot of mental health comes from being aligned in what you say and what you do. Yeah. So, and I think that's where authenticity lives. I think that's where meaning can come from. So then it's, I intend to be useful. I speak to being useful, and am I actually useful? And so that's, I think, maybe where I get a sense of meaning.
It's funny, though, because when you say it, I think love. But then I think, and I want the love because I lost my dad at 6 months, I lost my mum at 18, away at boarding school, blah, blah, blah. And then when I get lots of love, I actually don't want the love. It's too much. And I wonder, you know, we talked about, you know, ayahuasca and where people are going on journeys to rediscover who they naturally, or maybe who they are. How do you avoid the confusion of these different influences to be able to try and give a clear path of rational thinking of how to get somewhere?
How do you mean? Well,
so, like, for me, I've got this confused dichotomy of, is it me or is it an emotion? Is it, am I leaning on the past? Can I be celebrating the future? I'm not sure what I could lean on. So I sometimes don't know how to make a rational decision on what's best for me.
Yeah.
So there's a fear of going down the wormhole of ayahuasca or whatever platform. But then there's also is it a fear because there could be a huge celebration and a transformation of where things are going?
So there could be a fear of taking ayahuasca because it might reveal something to you that you don't actually want.
Correct.
Because once it's revealed, you're kind of like, screw it. It's sort of like,
that's the rest of my life.
Now, if I want, because your brain wants to remain aligned, it's like, now I got to do something about it. And if I don't, then I'm becoming aware that I'm deluding myself. And there's so many of us who are like that. And I would argue that possibly we all have that in different aspects. So I don't think that anyone is any one thing.
Right.
I think we're all contextual, first of all.
Yeah.
So there might be places where you love uncertainty.
Yeah.
And so you could be seen as a very open and, you know, adventurous person. But I could also imagine there are places in your life where you hate uncertainty.
Absolutely.
Right. So does that mean you're no longer an open person and all that? And, you know, I think when we truly pursue self-honesty, which I think is one of the most fundamental aspects of living a life, is to become honest with oneself. Because with that honesty comes, I hope, humility. And humility to me is the engine of creativity. Because humility to say, I don't know, which is, as you know, is, I think, where creativity doesn't begin, but it's a necessary step. That part of that self-honesty is to understand where how I'm contextual. And to understand that actually I'm kind of I can be complicated, which is diverse but not interconnected, versus complex, which is also diverse but now connected. And when people are diverse, but they find that common thing that holds it all together, that gives them that sense of, I think, well-being.
The grounding.
Where someone is diverse, like I'm all these things, but I have no idea what's holding it all together. Now I'm complicated. like many businesses, siloed, right? So finding that common principle that holds it all together, I think, is a wonderful thing. As a leader, as an organization, as an individual.
So take this on the other end of the spectrum, where as a neuroscientist, the difference between human and machine intelligence. How are you seeing this world of merging into a new source of rational thinking and a new source of data? And how, with that knowledge, should companies rethink how they engage with talent as a vehicle for transformation?
So AI, we've been doing AI for about 20 years. We've been doing it for quite a long time. We had the first neural networks that saw the same illusions that humans see.
Wow.
The way, this is long before the type of AI that's in the world now,
Right.
which in some senses, in principle, no different.
Yeah.
It's different in scale,
Yeah.
but not necessarily in terms of concept. They're almost like, they're not quite, but they're almost like MATLAB perceptrons.
Right.
And so we used to do what we call ecological modeling.
Right.
So we used to evolve our artificial neural networks. And then we would treat them as little critters, and then we would do behavioral experiments and neuroscience experiments on their brains. It was, and so basically it was a complete open-ended system. So we were seeing what would emerge. So we actually evolved color vision in our little neural networks. And it turns out the color vision processing was not unlike the color vision processing in our brain, right? But now we're God in the system, which means we could actually understand that whole history and look to see how does history and experience and architecture fit together and behavior, right? So that's how we were using them. So we're using neural networks to help us better understand the brain. So another potential use of AI is it can also help us understand society. Right. So the current systems are basically giving you answers according to what's normal, right? Because it's harvesting information that's present now, right?
Yeah.
So I asked actually today I asked ChatGPT to give me an answer as to whether a certain behavior in the world, a certain way of being, was good or bad, right? And I said, give me an answer as if you were an average person in 2024.
Wow.
And then I said, give me the answer as if you were an average person, normal person, in 1824. Okay? And the answer for the person if now is like, it's neither good or bad, it's just normal.
Huh.
The answer as if I was from 1824 is, it's bad.
Wow.
Okay? Now you can imagine what the question was I asked, right?
Sure.
And so, in other words, and the problem is, people will take these answers and they think that they're true, but they're not necessarily true. They're what's normal. Now, there are some aspects, especially for looking at physics or something like that, it's true for what we currently know. So I think there's tremendous possibility in helping us actually become wiser because we see it as a tool. We don't see it as a replacement of things.
Right.
So we use AI all the time. We're creating platforms for AI, knowledge bases and all this.
It's an enabler.
But it's an empower, possibly. And to help us achieve what we think is far more important, which is not knowledge, it's understanding. AI systems are knowledge-based systems, but they're not necessarily understanding-based systems.
Got it.
Right? So data is meaningless.
Yeah.
It's useful,
What are you doing?
but it's not meaningful. Right? It's the person who's making sense of the data that makes it meaningful.
So how do business leaders design their products and messaging to address this tech anxiety that comes from this?
So I don't have an answer to that question because it's very specific. And I mean, how do people? You could ask the question. We could ask the question more generally.
Yeah.
Like, how do we position our products and services according to people's sense of anxiety more generally, whether it be tech or the fact that there are wars going on and all this other stuff? Because, right? And I think one way of addressing that is people want to invest, whether I'm buying product or literal investment, into things increasingly that are seen to have real value in terms of humanity.
Right.
And again, I'm moving this away from the concept of purpose. I'm not actually so wedded to this concept of purpose that brands focus on, and some speakers focus on. It's more about how are you relevant, right? And how are you relevant to, how is your product or service relevant to the person, and have you ever evidenced that they're actually improving their life? And when you do that, the loyalty of your customer increases, because it's like, oh my goodness, you're decreasing my uncertainty. And I think every business is in some sense, one way or the other, in the business of uncertainty.
Right.
They're either increasing it or they're decreasing it. Take Game of Thrones. Right. Game of Thrones is in the business of uncertainty. Right. They ramp it up just like a DJ, like an Ibiza. Right. Yeah. You go to the nightclub. What is it? We work with DJs. The DJ is ramping up the music, and they're holding you there, and then they drop the beat. Right. They give you closure, but sometimes they drop it on a minor chord, and everyone goes ah, and then they ramp it up again, and they're playing with you. Right. Because they know you need that closure.
Yes.
Right. So Game of Thrones, the same thing. They ramp it up, but they don't give you. They don't drop it to a final to a major chord. They drop it to a minor.
Yeah.
Right. Because they know your brain needs closure. Right. So they're brilliant at knowing the level of uncertainty they can drop you to. They give you a little bit of closure, but not enough, because they know as soon as they give you full closure, the show's over. Right. So they're in the business of uncertainty. Pharmaceutical companies, they're in the business of uncertainty. Right. I have uncertainty about my health, my current health, my future health. Let me help you. Let me decrease that uncertainty. Investment company, right? Accountancy. It's all really about uncertainty, right? These are just different mediators of uncertainty. And so how am I therefore decreasing the uncertainty of the person that I'm, and how is what I'm doing relevant to that? And have I ever measured it? And if I do measure it and I can evidence it, why am I not sharing that? And that's what my Lab of Misfits does as a business. We help businesses better understand what they're actually in the business of in terms of the minds and the brains of their audience, and then evidencing that, and then using that as actually content for earned and paid media to share it.
Yeah. So how is the receptiveness to that? Because many organizational leaders don't want disruptive thought. They don't want to think in a different way. It's like, I want to go to A to B. How do you convince the benefit of this journey?
Because ultimately it has to be relevant to the fact that they're a business and they're there to survive and make a living, right? And ideally make as good a living as possible. The argument here is to say that actually there's a better way to make that living. And better in multiple ways. First, we can have a more complex value function, right? It's not just money. There could be other ways of valuing your output. But if we just restrict it to money, well, take earned and paid. Sorry, let's take recruitment and retention. What is it? I forget the system. Like if you have a company that's 50 people, you're spending $1 million a year on retention recruitment. Well, if you can say, well, actually, we're improving the lives of our audience in this way. First of all, those companies that do that outperform the stock market by 150%.
Wow.
Right? But only 2% of companies are perceived to be in the business of that. So there's a huge opportunity. That's one. The possibility for retention recruitment is massive, because people, again, if we go back to the beginning, what do I want to see in my life when I look back? Meaningful. If I'm coming into work and I'm actually improving people's life, I feel meaningful. Right? Now I'm loyal to the company, right? And also my audience. They're now loyal to me because now I'm more meaningful, because that's where the brain lives. The brain lives not necessarily in data, it lives in meaning.
Right.
And
can you flip that the other way around for your customers? So the customers have more meaning to the companies, not just in purchase, but in feeling and philosophy towards the business.
Well, that's interesting. I suppose yes. I mean, insofar as it becomes a relationship.
Right.
And in some sense, you can argue that that's what at the most fundamental level, that's what branding is. It's about deepening the relationship with my audience.
Right.
That's what all brands are trying to do in their branding. But almost always, unless they've actually evidenced it, it's just a slogan. Right. Look at all the brands. It's like, we do this. How do you know you do that?
Right.
We're in the business of compassion. How do you know you're in the business of compassion? It's just a slogan, right? Until they evidence it and then share that evidence, not only to update and evolve their products, but also share it with the audience, and also to share with the audience in a way that transcends their product. For instance, when we worked with a business which was about on wonder, right? And we said, that's what you're in the business of, is facilitating on wonder.
Yeah.
And when we went back to their employees and said, look, this is what you're doing on the brains of us, like, oh my God, I thought I was doing this. I didn't realize I was transforming the people who I'm engaged with, right? So
it wasn't just about the talents of the artist.
No.
Impacted the people.
And then vice versa. So now you have a relationship there.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, you have that friction. So with increased complexity, what behaviors no longer work?
Certainty doesn't work.
Certainty doesn't work.
Yeah, certainty doesn't work. And as we were talking about yesterday in the panel, it's about complexity, but it's actually the significance of complexity is interconnectivity.
Yeah.
Okay. Why does that matter? Because if everything's connected, let's take the opposite. Imagine nothing's connected. Well, if I disrupt the system a little bit, I disrupt 2 elements. Well, I only disrupt those 2 elements of the 100 that I could have disrupted. Only 2. Okay. That's a linear system. I disrupt 2 and I only get a consequence of 2. Now, if those 2 are actually connected with all the others, so the one is a complicated system. It's lots of different elements, completely non-connected.
Right.
A complex system is diverse, but they're all connected to each other. So if I disrupt those 2 things, that disruption affects all the others, right? Now that's what's called a non-linear impact. Now everyone listening will know exactly what that is, which is in the form of an avalanche, right? You add the small weight of a skier and the whole thing gives way.
Right.
It's because that snowbank is completely interconnected.
Yeah.
Okay? So you get this small input, huge effect, which means the future is completely unpredictable. That's why the weather can only be predicted accurately within a certain narrow time window.
Sure.
Right? Because it's a chaotic, nonlinear system. That's nature. That's life. That's the stock market. That's human behavior. Right? So what we tried to do is we tried to make our lives simpler by breaking off those connections, right? Rather than embracing the fact that that's actually the way nature works. Okay? So then the question is, how can we thrive in that complexity?
Right.
Well, the answer is therefore is not in predicting it, because that's impossible. The answer is in responding to it, right? Creating a culture of your organization that is able to be agile and adaptable to the inevitable change that's going to happen, right? Because you're going to make a choice. You have no idea if it's a good choice or a bad choice. It's a reasonable choice, but you don't know if the consequence is going to be good or bad, right? But you're going to disrupt the system by making that choice,
Right.
right? So the best choices happen within an agile organization, because now they're going to respond to the disruption that they just made.
So it's being in flow.
In a way,
Or dancing.
Dancing. It's like jazz.
Yeah.
Right? It's not playing to a script, because it's a really good idea. And businesses are they're constantly trying to maximize efficiency, which is brilliant, except the world continues to change. Right? So then they try to buy in creativity and all this kind of stuff, when what they really need is to have a system that can move between efficiency and creativity, right? So like I say in the talks, I don't want you to leave the room and if a bus is coming at you, think, I wonder if I can see this differently, right? No, you get out of the way, right? So, but the best leaders are those who can move and say, now this is a time we need to be creative, this is a time we need to be efficient, and they create the teams and the culture that's able and embraces that ability to move when the world moves.
And becomes one of the key values of the business.
Fundamental. And then what are those values? What are those ways of interacting that facilitate that?
Yeah.
And we call them the 10 C's. They're things like commitment, curiosity. Yeah. Curiosity is essential.
Yeah.
What your business is actually in the business of, what you care about, all this type of stuff.
So how can leaders create an environment? Obviously, they can engage with the brilliant work that you guys are doing, but how can they increase their odds of being in an environment that increases their uncertainty, but of success? Their success coming from celebrating the uncertainty of the unknown. How can they start a process of understanding what that means and embracing it into their corporate culture?
First of all, to realize that that is fundamental to their survival. That if they don't do it, they're going to get selected out.
Right.
Because this is literally what happens in nature.
Yeah.
Right. Things that don't, movement is life.
Right.
Things that don't move die. Right. Why? Because the world moves. So if you don't move with it, right. But that doesn't mean you always move. Right. That's where wisdom lives.
Yeah.
It's like, and that's kind of what's happening right now with AI. Everyone's now flooding into AI. Right. And it's almost like, have technology. We must do something with it.
Right.
Really?
Really?
Do you have to?
Yeah.
Right? So there isn't necessarily a lot of wisdom that's happening now with AI.
Yeah.
But surely it's going to transform things. That we know, but how and in what way. So it's if they don't move, they're going to get selected out. And the top CEOs know this, right? That their current business models are not going to work.
Right.
So they have to create adaptable organizations. But that means the CEO themselves need to also embody this.
Yeah.
Right? It has to become part of the leadership team. It has to be part of their way of being. They have to lead by example. And that's what will infect the organization. But then they also have to share that way of being with the organization themselves. Otherwise you get into this, the empath with the narcissist type metaphor. So that to me is one of the most fundamental things. But that's a real challenge for leaders. Because leaders think that they have to lead with certainty.
Yeah.
Like, this is the way we're going. I mean, look at like Hollywood films, right? We celebrate the hero that says, I know all the data. I know everyone's saying I should go this way, but I'm going this way. And then why? I just feel it, right? And there's some truth in that.
Yeah.
But also the worst things in life have also happened that way.
Yeah, right.
As well as, the best things in life don't make sense. What makes sense is normal and average. But it's creating that space that enables us to basically be creators, be scientists, to be a lab, to turn your business into a laboratory.
Yeah.
Right?
So the overarching thing is keep it simple and go back to being a being.
Interesting. Tell me, what do you mean?
Well, just we're born into this ecosystem of dance and celebration and interconnectivity.
Yeah. No,
but we fight against it by making it more complicated.
It's so true. And I think you're literally right when we say born into.
Yeah.
So I have 4 gremlins, 25, 23, 22, and a 1-year-old, right?
Right.
And to me, they're like wonderful experiments.
Yeah.
And because my background's actually in developmental neuroscience. And I just find it fascinating how this little guy, how he's learning and everything, and how he has this insatiable something new. He's like, he's crawling for it. Right?
Yeah.
We come into the world with these skills. We come into the world with curiosity, with compassion, and with courage. Confidence is not interesting, but with courage, to do something knowing that it might fail. Right? So the problem is our society, our education system, and our corporate structures teach it out of us.
Right.
We don't reward curiosity. Reward answers.
Yeah.
And yet we know that the cash lives in brilliant questions. But we don't reward questions. Why? Because now, especially as a leader, your question might be doubting me. Well, so how many leaders are like, create this
Don't
or a
doubt.
hierarchy? You don't doubt me, right? I know what I'm doing, right? So much of that, and the more strongly they feel that way, actually more insecure they often are inside, right? So they have to, could also be historical. Like, I've brought us to this point, so, I must be doing something, right? They don't acknowledge the fact that a lot of that is circumstance, contextual, and happenstance, right? The luck that was involved in any of us being successful, right? And yet we will reward ourselves and think that we did it all.
Yeah.
Right? So to let go of that can be really, really difficult.
Get rid of so much stress.
That's right. And so we reward these things that so now our curiosity is dampened, our courage is dampened, our willingness to ask questions is dampened, and instead we reward things like things that are in fact relevant to narcissistic behavior, because that's often what we reward. So then it's not surprised we have fairly that type of leadership.
Yeah.
But what would happen if instead we rewarded curiosity? Like, that's a brilliant question. I didn't think of that.
Celebrate it.
Celebrate it, reward it, because your brain is constantly looking for feedback, right? Everything we do for feedback. You text message, why? to get a text message back. Otherwise, you don't exist, right? Your brain has no ideas exist. It's called the ghost effect. If I push on something and nothing happened, if I got no effect, do I even exist? And one of the greatest gifts you can give to a person is the gift of existence, right?
Being seen.
To be seen, right? The power of listening to someone, to entering conflict with the ideas like, actually, maybe I'll learn something from you, rather than I'm going to convince you of something, right? Now you exist, and we don't do that in education. We don't do that in corporate worlds, and to our demise.
What a note to end on. To rethink here at Innovation Realised with that philosophy. I think everyone goes home with a backpack of solution. So thank you for taking time with me today.
Thank you.
Absolutely awesome, Beau. And I could keep going for hours, but I know you have other things to get on with. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for enjoying the conversation.
Excellent.